Released in 2019, the Rodecaster Pro, bust onto the podcasting scene like a bull through a china shop. And 7 years later, this machine sits as one of the most influential releases of a piece of audio gear in the past 50 years. Which makes the following question seem kind of, silly. Is this piece of relatively recent tech still a viable option in 2026? Now, while we sit here in our 2026 ivory towers where gear like the Rodecaster Video S is actually something you can buy, it's easy to forget how meaningful and impactful this unit was to the world when it was released. Remember, before this, podcasting had some real catches. One of the biggest was mix minus. Now, if that sounds familiar but you have no idea what it is or why it's important, don't worry about it. That's okay. Mostly because mix minus in the world of home studios and podcasting these days has been made somewhat of a non-issue. And that is mostly thanks to the Rodecaster series. But what it is pretty simple. It's the mix minus something. Now, to put that more plainly, it is the mix minus the audio of the person you're talking to. Now, why is that so important? Well, when you record with a guest, you want the caller to hear themselves as you normally would on a phone, as well as you speak to them. But they don't want to hear themselves through you or your audio. Because after their voice goes through your interface and computer and back out again, there's a sickening delay. So mix minus allows you, the person controlling the board, to send them a mix of the audio minus their audio. Now, mix minus is useful for many things, but this is generally the gist as it applies to a multitude of situations. But this Rodecaster did so much more than just mix minus. For example, if you wanted to know how to podcast pre-2019, there were few user-friendly options for the absolute clueless, i.e. podcasters. While a Zoom H-Series recorder might not make you bat an eyelash, hand something like that to someone that knows nothing about audio, that's a pretty steep learning curve, especially on those older units from pre-2020. It wasn't just something you picked up on a whim and just started doing. Not to mention, the whole act of production was a massively daunting concept for those aforementioned audio illiterate. And when the Rodecaster Pro came around, you could literally have everyone sounding great with the touch of a couple buttons, and you didn't have to worry about compression and EQ settings. It just worked. Even something simple like phantom power, which still does confuse some people to this day, was made insignificant with this board. What kind of mic are you using? Dynamic or condenser? It was that simple. And boom, you have phantom if you need it. Then, going back to the production part of this, the original Rodecaster Pro here offered the user a chance to produce their show as they did it. You could pre-produce a segment or interview and stash it in these pads. Hell, intros and outros didn't have to be added in post anymore. You want silly little sound effects? Sure. Not to mention, this thing was portable. You could record your whole show in multi-track on an SD card. But the biggest win the Rodecaster had wasn't a feature or a button. It was actually how the company operated. Because in late 2019, there was a storm coming, and podcasting was about to blow up.
On your side with an update on the rapidly evolving response to a new virus spreading out of Asia. One man in Washington state becoming the first confirmed case of coronavirus in the U.S.
Now, depending on where you are in the world, this started to impact your day-to-day at different times. Here in Canada and a lot of the U.S., things started coming to a skid in March of 2020. The word that would be used to describe what happened in the coming months was unprecedented. And if you recall, this had a couple major sweeping effects on people, outside of the whole virus deal. And toilet paper was an issue for some reason. Now, the first big change in 2020 was personal, as a lot of people got a chance to really dig in or develop a new hobby. Some of my friends got into bread. Some started an instrument. Some even tried out divorce. But one thing became horrifically clear as we got a couple months into the lockdowns. We were very much running short on entertainment. Our favorite shows just ran out because nothing was being produced. And it was around this time that people started looking for and creating more content. YouTube exploded with new user-made content, and a lot of people discovered that YouTube could be more than just how to change the oil in my car. But the big boom came in the form of another type of content: podcasts. This was the start of the podcast boom, because this was the kind of content that anyone could do. Get a microphone, get an interface, figure out how to use a DAW, and just go. There was no excuse for a lack of time at this point, and most of the barriers were down, especially as this thing existed. And that brings us to our next big thing that happened during this time to affect people. And that can be summed up as supply chain. Now, to be honest, the world just fell apart. And while that toilet paper joke earlier was for the funny, it also kind of illustrates this point all the more. Supply chains just crumbled because, well, supply chains need people. And those people weren't working. They weren't developing. They weren't fabricating. They weren't delivering. New products just weren't happening. And even if they did, the idea that you could get one was absolutely laughable. All of what I just said just happens to be one of the best things to happen to Rode. You see, if you look at any of their products, it says right on them, they are made in Australia. But it goes deeper than that. It's all made by Rode in Rode factories. They are their own supply chain. And for a lot of companies that relied on China as the beginning of their supply chain, we all know what happened there, right? But for Rode, they just kept supplies flowing, meaning all those hungry new podcasters didn't have to worry if they wanted some gear. It was just there. Okay, so let's take a look at this. This is the Rodecaster Pro, obviously. It is touchscreen, but you'll notice there's a lot less touch options on this screen other than the buttons that are available. Now, you're also going to notice a couple other things, and that is that it's relatively basic as you go through all of these sub-menus and stuff, and you don't have as much to play with in these, despite the audio processing obviously being in there and being able to change the controls. Now, when this thing launched, the actual controls channel to channel were very basic, and they did upgrade these over time as this thing kind of matured in the marketplace. But you are going to notice, compared to the Rodecaster Pro 2, again, the options of what you can do in here are very basic. It's nothing really overwhelmingly amazing. You're not going to get lost in any of these submenus, much like the Rodecaster Pro 2, which actually did have a learning curve and kept you kind of immersed trying to figure out what everything did and kind of how to get to everything. And sometimes even needing to go online just to find out how do you get to a specific setting. But once again, that simplicity was intentional. They wanted you to be able to sit down with this and just go and just be able to do stuff. They wanted you to be able to figure this out like that. They wanted everybody with any kind of education level to be able to use this thing. So it meant making things as simple as possible with this. And I think that's one of the brightest things that Rode did with this whole concept is they made it dumb simple. I called it that back in the day when I reviewed this originally, way back in my first studio, which was my concrete prison of a basement. And they really did make sure this was something that people were able to easily figure out. And of course, they did have an app, and we'll go through that on the screen here. And you can see this is a bit more of a breakdown, that stuff they couldn't really do on the machine. They had more of a visual of what was happening with the different things like the compressor, with the de-esser, the noise gate, and the high pass. You could actually have a little bit more control over that stuff. And this is where you could expand a few of those things that you could get to on the unit, but it was a little bit easier to play with this stuff on the actual computer, as well as bringing in sounds, as well as like controlling podcasts and all that stuff. This was very much a way to allow you to put this board aside and operate stuff from the computer. Of course, with the Rodecaster Pro 2, that all kind of became so much more. And instead of being multiple windows like this, it became one big Rodecaster app, which was really cool. And you can actually see that when I open up the Rodecaster app. I've got the Rodecaster video hooked to another computer, and I can go into that, and it's all one app, and it's all very seamless. And you don't have to really go looking for stuff. I mean, after all of that, are there any drawbacks? Not really, if I'm being honest. This thing checked all the boxes, and it still kind of does. Now, remember, we're looking at this initially through the lens of 2019. There was one quirk when they launched that did irk me, and that was the lack of proprietary multi-track support. They cleared that up rather quickly, I must say. Now, beyond that, some people like to complain about the preamps as they had a self-noise of neg 125 dBu. And again, for 2026, it isn't great, but with that 2019 lens, it was perfectly fine. It's even still usable in 2026, and especially if you're rocking a dynamic mic that isn't as gain hungry as an SM7B or even a condenser microphone. You won't notice any of that noise. The other big issue this thing faced, though, was the gain range. This thing, as it was in 2019, came with a rather respectable 55 dB of gain. That's one thing that did not age very well. But again, with the right mic, or if you did want to use that gain-hungry SM7B, you just needed a signal booster. Just something as simple as that, and both the EIN and the gain, they're non-issues. So with all that considered, does this thing hold up in 2026? Well, surprisingly, yes. It has all the features that a podcast could still use. And I do know that there are several and rather large podcasts out there still using this, the Rodecaster Pro, the original. But of course, there are some things that you give up by holding firm on the OG here. One of those is the amazing app support that the new Rodecasters get. As you saw, the original did have an app. And through that 2019 lens we keep mentioning, it was fine. But it doesn't hold much of a candle to the updated app and the controls. Not to mention all the integration to work with the whole ecosystem like the wireless lineup. Then you have the dual PC setups, smart pads with the second generation. There are for sure perks in moving up in the digital world, but that doesn't negate this. You can still use this in 2026 and be very happy and produce amazing audio. Because I think we forget something. And I did kind of mention it in the beginning of this video. You see, a 7-year-old piece of tech like this isn't old. There's people out there still rocking mixers from the 90s. Dylan, my co-host on my live stream on Fridays, is one of those people. And while digital gear may have more upside for that upgrade, year-over-year improvements don't make stuff like this Rodecaster Pro obsolete. And considering what we're using to podcast before this was even released, I think you're going to be just fine with this. But I do have to ask, this is my first time with this beast. Are there any other video ideas I can pull out of this thing? Let me know your ideas down below. Cheers, guys. Thanks for watching.